Chapter 24, Section 1 of J.B. Bury's The Student's Roman Empire, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lenny. The Student's Roman Empire, Part 2, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 24, Trajan's Principate, Continued. 98 to 117 AD. Section 1. Trajan's Administration, Rome and Italy. Trajan ranks amongst the greatest emperors of Rome, but he stands alone. He boldly inaugurated a new policy of conquest, but his successors refused to walk in the path which he marked out. His originality was fruitless. He did not influence the ages which succeeded him. The province of Dacia, his only work that was in any way abiding, ceased to be Roman before 2 centuries had elapsed. Trajan was, above all, a soldier, and his aggressive policy was largely due to this fact. His military undertakings were successful, but the reports of them, which have come down, are not sufficient to let us judge whether his strategy was original. He was robust in mind and body. He had a clear understanding, but one of a thoroughly practical turn, and he had no taste for literature. He was not averse to pleasures, but was careful not to indulge in them to the hurt of others. He was genial and popular in his manner, and used to play the part of a comrade to his soldiers. His chief foible was vanity. He was fond of naming places after himself and members of his family. He caused the title of Augusta to be conferred not only on his wife Plotina, but on his sister Marciana and her daughter Matidia. Trajan's personal appearance was noble and impressive. He was tall of stature, and his features were regular. He had an aquiline nose, a broad and low forehead, thick straight-cut hair. He was the first emperor to whom a special name was given to designate his personal qualities. In 100 A.D. the Senate conferred on him the name Optimus, which, however, he did not adopt as one of his titles until a later period, 114 A.D. In his relations with the senators, Trajan was studiously moderate in language and demeanor. He was careful to maintain the fiction that the Senate was a free body, as in the days of the Republic. He proposed to be a princeps, not like Domitian a dominus. "You bid us be free," says Pliny. "We will be free." He faithfully kept his oath never to take the life of a senator. When his friend Licinius Sura was secretly charged with a treasonable conspiracy, he sent for Sura's physician to anoint his eyes and let himself be shaved by Sura's barber. Next day he said, "If my friend proposed to take my life, he might have compassed his design yesterday." Calpurnius Crassus, who had been pardoned by Nerva, afterwards conspired against Trajan, and was put to death, not however by the emperor, but by his own senatorial colleagues. But while Trajan disarmed opposition, and won golden opinions by outward respect for the fathers, and by the observance of superficial forms, he avoided having to restore to the Senate any real powers. He retained the substance of monarchy, and endeavored to render it palatable by a show of equality between the monarch and the other senators. He made no objection to the expression of republican sentiments, and allowed the followers of Thracia and Helvidius to indulge in their harmless hero-worship of Brutus and Cassius. Yet men like Pliny did not disguise from themselves that they were under the absolute rule of a single man, but they recognized that he worked for the public weal. Thus the policy of Trajan resembled that of Vespasian, except that Trajan was more affable and more tolerant. But he developed the monarchical principle in at least 2 ways. 1. He did not assume a perpetual censorship like Domitian, but he did what was more unconstitutional. He created new patricians without assuming the censorship at all. This was equivalent to claiming censorial power as part of the imperial prerogative. 2. he instituted an imperial control over the local administration of the towns of Italy, of the free cities in the imperial provinces, and of the cities which were subject to the administration of the Senate. These three classes of the community were hitherto exempt from the interference of the emperor, and the appointment of an imperial officer called curator republicae with control over the affairs of such a community was a distinct step in the growth of monarchy. The curator was of equestrian or senatorial rank, and was chosen from some neighboring community. He had control over the municipal administration, especially in regard to the public buildings and the town rent roll. In many cases, doubtless, and especially in the senatorial provinces, there had been financial mismanagement, and the intervention of the state was beneficial. But the political tendency of the measure was to increase the sphere of the emperor's influence on the one hand, and to level the distinction existing between the various communities of the empire on the other. The control of the emperor in Italy tended to reduce the mother country to the position of the subject lands, and the intervention of imperial officers to correct the state of the free communities seriously diminished the value of their privileges. Otherwise, Trajan's policy in domestic and civil administration was not marked by any particular tendency. He does not appear to have been guided much by general principles, but rather to have dealt with each question as it arose on its own merits. Many beneficial results in special departments of law were achieved by his legislation. Like Claudius, he used personally to deal out judgment in the tribunals of Rome, and used himself to try all cases of appeal to the imperial court. His spirit of moderation and equity is expressed in the sentiment, which is attributed to him, that it is better that the guilty should escape unpunished than that the innocent should be condemned. The state finances seem to have been managed by Trajan with discretion and success, for, notwithstanding the large expenses incurred by his wars and his buildings, no increase of taxation was found necessary. On the contrary, the duty on inheritances, vicesima hereditatum, was alleviated in certain cases. Trajan published a budget with the details of the public expenditure, a popular measure, but also a politic move, as showing how favorably his administration compared with that of his predecessors. He also established a special court to deal with fiscal lawsuits. The secret of Trajan's financial success lay partly in the strict economy of his court, but also in the large increase of revenue derived from the province of Dacia and its rich mines. One feature of his reign has received severe condemnation. He adopted from his predecessors the practice of giving congiaria to the people of Rome, but increased the amount of the donation to an extravagant height. His first congiarium, 99 A.D., was probably no larger than that of Nerva, 75 denarii, £2 10 a head, but his second and third distributions of money, after each Dacian war, amounted to 650 denarii a head. He thus introduced a precedent of extravagant charity which became a serious tax on his successors. Though it was the general tendency under the empire to alleviate the conditions of slavery, Trajan inclined in a contrary direction, and passed some laws which made the discipline of servitude harder. By the existing legislation, when a master was assassinated, all his slaves were condemned to death. Trajan introduced a new regulation by which not only the testamentary freedmen, but those freedmen who had received their liberty during their master's life, and possessed either wholly or partly Roman citizenship, were subjected to torture. He also issued an edict that a freedman or slave who had obtained from the emperor Roman citizenship in its complete form without the knowledge of his patron or master, and possessed thereby the right of freely disposing of his property, should retain the right during his lifetime, but should on his death be regarded as a freedman possessing only the jus latinum, so that his fortune might revert to his patron. Trajan followed the example of Nerva in paying special attention to the welfare of Italy. The possibility of an invasion by the barbarians beyond the Danube, which in Domitian's reign may have seemed near enough, may have awakened the minds of statesmen to the importance of maintaining the population and encouraging agriculture in Italy, if only for the purpose of strengthening her against a hostile attack. In 4 ways Trajan came to the rescue of Italy. In the first place, he carried on, extended, and modified the elementary institutions which Nerva had founded. This policy directly contributed to encourage marriage and raise the population. Secondly, the state further encouraged small proprietors by advancing loans at small interest. Thirdly, Trajan renewed the law of Tiberius that all provincials who became senators must invest a third of their property in Italian land. Fourthly, he tried to hinder emigration from Italy by an ordinance that no Italians should take part in the foundation of new colonies. This Italian policy involved the principle that the provinces were to contribute to the maintenance of the mother country. It was a principle which was not then disputed, but which was manifestly unfair, inasmuch as the legions which defended the provinces were no longer recruited from Italy. On the other hand, as we have seen, the institution of curatores tended to deprive Italy of political privileges. Trajan concerned himself with the improvement of Italian traffic both by sea and land. He restored the harbours of Ostia and Centumcelle, Civita Vecchia, on the west coast, and enlarged that of Ancona on the east. At Ostia he excavated a very large hexagonal basin, still called the Lago Trajano, and connected it with the port of Claudius by 2 smaller basins. This new port was surrounded with quays and buildings for magazines. He constructed a road through the Pontine marshes on the coast of Latium, and converted the mule path which led directly from Beneventum to Brundisium into a regular road, called Via Traiana. Nor did he neglect the welfare of Rome. He improved the water supply by executing important repairs of the Aqua Marcia and the Anio Novus, and conferred a great benefit on the inhabitants of the Transtiberine quarter by building an aqueduct to supply them, the Aqua Traiana. This aqueduct derived its waters from the Lacus Sabatinus, and is used at the present day under the name of the Aqua Paula. Trajan built 2 public baths, the Thermae Traianae, near the baths of Titus, intended exclusively for the use of women, and the Thermae Surianae, in memory of his friend Licinius Sura. He arranged for a cheaper supply of bread in Italy and Rome by reorganizing the Guild of Bakers, a considerable concession on Trajan's part, as he always manifested great jealousy of collegia and corporations. The list of those who received corn was revised, and 5,000 poor children were placed among the recipients. The great monument of Trajan in Rome was his new Forum, which was confessed by posterity to be one of the most striking sights of the city. It lay in a narrow valley, which he formed by cutting off a spur between the Capitoline and the Quirinal hills, and was designed to form a connecting link between the other fora and the Campus Martius. It was in fact a northerly continuation of the Forum of Augustus. The execution of the design was entrusted to Apollodorus of Damascus, the skilful architect who built the bridge of the Danube at Turnus Severin. The western and eastern sides of the Forum were formed by semicircles hewn out of the hills, in front of which were rectilineal porticos enclosing the area. In the middle of the space was an equestrian statue of the emperor. The southern side was occupied by a magnificent entrance, and the northern by the Basilica Ulpiana, a large edifice. Behind it was the Pillar of Trajan, which has been already described, in the centre of a small place, whose sides were formed by 2 libraries, one of Latin, the other of Greek works. Beyond this space was a temple, completed after Trajan's death, and consecrated to him by his successor. End of section 1.
24, sections 2 and 3 of J.B. Bury's The Student's Roman Empire, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. The Student's Roman Empire, Part 2, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 24, Trajan's Principate. Section 2. Administration of the Provinces. Correspondence of Pliny and Trajan. The corruption of the governors of the senatorial provinces is illustrated by the cases of Marius Priscus and Caecilius Classicus, which occurred at the beginning of Trajan's reign. Marius Priscus, who had been proconsul of Africa, was accused in 99 A.D. by the Provincials and prosecuted by Pliny and the historian Tacitus. The case came before the Senate in the following year, Trajan as consul presiding. It was proved that Marius had indeed fleeced the ephri. For a bribe of 300,000 sesterces he had banished a knight and put to death 7 of his friends. He flogged, sentenced to the mines, and finally strangled another knight for a bribe of 700,000. The sentence of the court was that the 700,000 should be paid to the aerarium, and that Marius should be exiled from Italy. This was a poor compensation to the province for its sufferings. Soon after this Pliny prosecuted Classicus, formerly governor of Baetica, at the instance of the inhabitants. His guilt was proved, but he died before the trial. In the administration of the provinces, Trajan's reign offers nothing noteworthy, except liberality in the construction of new roads, and the policy, already mentioned, of intervening in the affairs of free communities by means of a curator republicae, and sending special commissioners to senatorial provinces. Thus Sextus Quintilius Maximus was sent to Achaia, probably to supervise the affairs of the free states of Greece. In this policy Trajan did not aim at uniformity. He only adopted it in cases where special circumstances seemed to demand his intervention. The wretched condition to which the province of Bithynia had been reduced by the incompetent rule of the senatorial proconsuls was a case which called for the emperor's interference, and he saw good to make it temporarily an imperial province. He probably made the loss good to the Senate by assigning to it the province of Pamphylia instead. He appointed Pliny as legatus Augusti pro praetori, to restore order in the demoralized province. The Provincials had instituted suits against corrupt proconsuls, and while the proceedings had dragged slowly on, the finances had fallen into disorder, the public buildings remained unfinished, and social life had been completely paralyzed. Pliny, who had had no previous experience of provincial government, referred to the Emperor for instruction on every question which arose, and their correspondence has come down to us. It shows us that Trajan was averse to treating different cases in the same way, or applying a general rule, as Pliny suggested to do, to the whole province. He adopted the more equitable and more troublesome plan of paying regard to the local usages and special traditions of each community. It would be a great mistake to infer from the minute details with which the Emperor concerned himself in the case of Bithynia, that he devoted the same attention to the minor affairs of all the other provinces of the empire. On the contrary, he seems to have laid a great deal of responsibility on the shoulders of the governors. Bithynia was a special case. Its condition at this time is one among many pieces of evidence that the government of the imperial provinces was far better than that of the senatorial. The correspondence of Trajan and Pliny gives a most interesting glimpse of the questions and affairs which the Emperor had to deal with in governing the provinces, and it is all the more valuable as our record of Trajan's reign is otherwise meagre. The following abbreviated extracts from the correspondence will serve to give an insight into some sides of Roman provincial government. They will also illustrate the practical judgment of Trajan, and the narrow limits within which Pliny was permitted to decide for himself. 1. Imperial authorization of public works. Pliny: may the people of Prusa be authorized to replace their bath-house, which is old and dilapidated, with new termi. Money will be forthcoming for the work. Trajan: yes, if the construction will not be too great a burden for their strength or necessitate the imposition of a special tax. Pliny: Sinope lacks water. I have found a copious spring of good quality 16 miles away, but the aqueduct will have to pass for a distance of about a mile over soft and uncertain ground. I can easily raise the money required, it only remains for me to secure your approval. Trajan, make this aqueduct, but first carefully examine whether the suspicious locality can bear it, and whether the expense does not exceed the ability of the town. Pliny, Nicomedia has expended over 3,000,000 sesterces £24,000 on an aqueduct which has been abandoned and is now in ruins, 2,000,000 £16,000 on another which has also been abandoned. I have means for making a third which will stand, if you will send an inspector of aqueducts or an architect. Trajan, supply Nicomedia with water, but investigate by whose fault so much money has been wasted. Pliny, Nicaea has expended 10,000,000 sesterces £80,000 on a theatre which is tottering, and great sums on a gymnasium which was burned and which they are rebuilding. At Claudiopolis they are excavating a bath-house at the foot of a mountain, with the money which the decurions appointed by you pay for their admission to the curia. What am I to do with respect to all these works? Send me an architect to advise. Trajan, you are on the spot, decide. As for architects, we at Rome sent to Greece for them. You will therefore find them about you. Pliny, Amastris is infected by a sewer which ought to be covered. If you permit the work to be executed, I have the money required. Trajan, cover this infectious stream. Pliny, there is a great lake on the confines of the territory of Nicomedia, Lake Sophon, about 10 miles east of that city. It would be highly advantageous to connect it with the sea by a canal. Send me an engineer. Trajan, take care that the lake, in uniting with the sea, does not run out entirely. I will send you from here men conversant with this kind of work. 2. Supervision of municipal finances. Pliny, the money due to towns of the province has been called in, and no borrowers at 12% are to be found. Ought I to reduce the rate of interest, or, if that fails to attract borrowers, compel the decurions to borrow the money in equal shares on suitable security? Trajan, put the interest low enough to find borrowers, but do not force anyone to borrow against his will. Such a course would be inconsistent with the temper of our century. Pliny, in the free and fettered city of Amissus, which, thanks to you, is governed by its own laws, a request has been handed to me concerning societies for mutual aid, errani. I mention the circumstance that you may consider how far they may be tolerated, and how far they must be forbidden. Trajan, allow them their societies, which the treaty of federation gives them, especially if, instead of spending their contributions on illicit assemblies, they employ them to assist their poorer members. In the other towns which are subject to our dominion it should not be permitted. Pliny, most of my predecessors have accorded to the towns of Pontus and Bithynia a priority of claim upon the property of their debtors. It would be well if some permanent regulation were made on this matter. Trajan, let it be decided according to the special laws of each town. If they have not a privilege over other creditors, I ought not to grant it to them at the expense of private individuals. Pliny, the inhabitants of the colony of Apamea request me to examine their accounts, despite their ancient privilege of administering their own affairs. Ought I to comply? Trajan, yes, since they themselves desire it. Assure them that your inspection is by my desire, and will not prejudice their privileges. Pliny, Julius Piso received 40,000 denarii 20 years ago as a public gift from Amissus. The public prosecutor, Ecdicus, claims this sum in accordance with your edicts, which forbid such acts of liberality. Piso urges the length of time that has elapsed, and professes that repayment would ruin him. Trajan, if the gift dates back more than 20 years, let it not be revoked, for we must regard the security of the individual citizens while taking care of the public funds. Pliny, I enclose a memorial of the Nicaeans. Trajan, they pretend to have received from Augustus the privilege of collecting the inheritance of all their fellow citizens who die intestate. Examine this affair in the presence of the parties. along with the procurators Gamelinus and my freedman Epimachus, and decide what may appear to you just. Pliny. I have been examining the expenses of the Byzantines. They spend annually 12,000 sesterces, £96, on the travelling expenses of a legatus bearing to you a formal honorary decree, and 3,000, £24, in sending an envoy to salute the governor of Mysia. Have I done right in cutting down both expenses? Trajan. It is enough for them to forward to me through your hands their decree of homage. As for the governor of Mysia, he will pardon them if they make their court to him cheaper. 3. The Decurions. Pliny. In certain towns of the province, the decurions supranumerum are obliged, on their admission to the curia, to subscribe some thousand, about £35, others 2,000 denarii. It pertains to you, sire, to make a general law. Trajan. No, it is safest to follow the custom of each town, especially regarding those who are made decurions against their wish. Pliny. The law of Pompeius observed in Bithynia requires the age of 30 years for exercising the function of the magistracy and entering the senate. But an edict of Augustus permits the inferior magistracies to be held at the age of 22. I have concluded that those who become magistrates under this edict ought to have seats in the municipal senate, although under 30 years of age. But what about those who, being of the prescribed age for holding magistracies, have not obtained them? Trajan. Close the senate house to them. 4. Right of citizenship. Pliny. To obtain the right of citizenship in a Bithynian town, it is necessary, by the law of Pompeius, not to be a citizen of any other Bithynian community. Many of the decurions in every community are in this position. Should they be excluded from the senate house? Trajan. No, but see to it that in future the law of Pompeius be better observed. 5. Protection for the towns. Pliny. Byzantium has a legionary centurion sent by the legatus of Lower Mysia, according to your directions, to watch over its privileges. Juliopolis, on the frontier of Bithynia, requests of you the same favour. Trajan. Byzantium is a great city, where a large number of strangers land. Its magistrates require some military assistance. But if I give such help to Juliopolis, all the small towns will want the same thing. It devolves upon you to watch that no injury be done to the cities under your government. 6. Religious matters. Pliny. May a temple of Cybele at Nicomedia be removed to a more convenient site? Trajan. Yes, the proceeding cannot violate a lex dedicationis, as provincial soil is not capable of receiving consecrations according to Roman law. Pliny. I have been asked for permission to transfer some dead bodies from their present tombs. At Rome a decision of the pontiffs is required. What shall I do here? Trajan. Grant or refuse according to the merits of the case. It would be too hard to require provincials to come and consult the pontiffs at Rome in this matter. Pliny. I have found a ruined house suitable for the bath to be built at Prusa. The proprietor built a temple to Claudius in the peristylium, but nothing is left of it. Is there any objection? Trojan. Put the bath in this house, unless the temple was actually completed, for even though it may have disappeared, the soil remains sacred to him. Pliny. It is said that a woman and her sons were buried in the same place where your statue is set up. The statue is in a library, the burial place is in a large court surrounded by a colonnade. I pray you to enlighten me as to the decision of this affair. Trajan. You should not have hesitated about such a question, for you know very well that I do not propose to make my name respected by terror and judgments of majestas. Dismiss the accusation. 7. Military discipline. Pliny. Should the prisoners be guarded by soldiers, or, according to custom, by public slaves? I have stationed some of both. Trajan. It is better to adhere to usage, and the soldier must not be called away from his flag. Pliny. 2 slaves have been found among the recruits. What shall be done with them? Trajan. If they have been enlisted, the fault lies with the recruiting officer. If they have been furnished as substitutes, you must punish those whose places they fill. If, knowing their condition, they have come and offered themselves, execute them. 8. Civil discipline. Pliny. In many towns, persons condemned to the mines or to fight as gladiators are serving as public slaves and receiving wages. What is to be done? Trajan: execute the sentences, except where the condemnation dates back more than 10 years, and in the latter case cause the convicts to be employed in such menial offices as are nearly penal, such as cleaning the public baths and the sewers. Pliny: a man who was sentenced to perpetual banishment by Bassus, proconsul of Bithynia in 98 A.D., has remained in the province, though he has not made use of the right given him by the Senate after the rescinding of the acts of Bassus, to claim within 2 years a new trial. Trajan: he has disobeyed the law. Send him in chains to my praetorian prefects for a more rigorous punishment. Pliny: those assuming the toga virilis, celebrating a marriage, inaugurating some public work, or entering on a magistracy, are accustomed to invite the decurions and many of the plebs, sometimes more than 1,000 persons, and to give each one a denarius or two. I am afraid that the numbers at these gatherings are excessive, though you have yourself allowed invitations on special occasions. Trajan: you are right, but I have made choice of your wisdom for the express purpose of reforming all the abuses of the province. Pliny: a great fire has devastated Nicomedia. Would it not be well to establish a society of 150 firemen? Trajan: no. Corporations, whatever the name they bear, are sure to become political associations. Supply the apparatus of buckets, warn the proprietors, and, in case of need, employ the populace. Section 3. The Christians. The letter of Pliny and the reply of his master which have excited most interest and led to most discussion are those concerning the punishment of Christians. Until Domitian's reign, the Christians had been regarded as a Jewish sect, and had been treated as Jews. Since the death of Gaius, the Jews had never been forced to take part in the divine worship of the emperors, and the Christians shared in this immunity, as the state did not recognize their distinction from the Jews. But the fall of Jerusalem brought about a change in the position of Christianity, by emancipating it from its home in Palestine and leading to its wider propagation among the Gentiles. This propagation led to the recognition of the distinction between Jews and Christians. It was observed that the proselytizing efforts of the Jews proper were attended with unimportant results, whereas the Christian sect increased rapidly. The Roman government was only ready to tolerate the opposition of the Jews to the state religion, so long as there was no danger of Jewish doctrines spreading among subjects of other races. The question, therefore, was whether they should suppress the Jewish religion altogether, including Christianity as a species of Judaism, or should deal with the Christians separately. Domitian chose the latter alternative towards the close of his reign. A refusal to worship the emperor's image was regarded as an act of sacrilege, and such worship was required from Christians, though not from Jews. A Christian named Antipas suffered death at Pergamum for refusing to comply with this requisition. At Rome, Flavius Clemens was put to death, and Domitilla banished on a charge of sacrilege, and it seems probable that they were Christian converts. The year 95, in which these things happened, may be regarded as the date at which Christianity came into conflict with the state religion, and was forbidden. As the Christian faith compelled those who professed it to set at naught the established religion, Christians were regarded by the law as sacrilegious, and to be suspected of Christianity was equivalent to being suspected of sacrilege. An important consequence followed. It was one of the duties of every provincial governor to seek out and punish all sacrilegious persons, brigands, robbers, and others who infested his province. As the Christians came under the head of sacrilegi, the governor was not only able, but was required, to deal with them according to his own discretion, without receiving any special imperial instructions. It was part of Nerva's reaction against the policy of Domitian that accusations of this kind of sacrilege were not encouraged, but the principle was not changed. Christians were still punishable, and this was an acknowledged fact when Pliny was governor of Bithynia. The wide diffusion of the forbidden religion in this province became known to Pliny in 112 A.D., when he issued Trajan's rescript forbidding societies (Hetairai). The enemies of the Christians took the opportunity of pointing out that they were in the habit of holding illicit assemblies. Pliny describes his investigation of the question in his letter to Trajan, of which the tenor is in brief as follows: I have never been present at the resolutions taken concerning the Christians, therefore I know not for what causes or how far they may be objects of punishment; and I have hesitated considerably in considering whether the difference of age should make any difference in our procedures. Are those who retract their belief to be pardoned? Must they be punished for the profession alone, although otherwise innocent? I have pursued the following method. I have asked them whether they were Christians, and to those who avowed the profession I have put the same question a second and a third time, and have enforced it by threats of punishment. When they have persevered, I have ordered them to be led to execution. For whatever their confession might be, their audacious behaviour and immovable obstinacy undoubtedly demanded punishment. I have reserved some who shared in the same kind of madness, but were Roman citizens, to be sent to Rome. An anonymous information was put into my hands, containing a list of many persons who deny that they are or ever were Christians. For, repeating the form of invocation after me, they called upon the gods, and offered incense and made libations to your image, and they uttered imprecations against Christ, to which no true Christian, as they affirm, can be compelled by any punishment whatever. I thought it best, therefore, to dismiss them. Others of them said at first that they were Christians, and then immediately afterwards denied it, and said that they had entirely renounced the error several years before. All these worshipped your image and the images of the gods, and they even vented imprecations against Christ. They affirmed that the sum total of their fault or their error consisted in assembling upon a certain stated day before it was light to sing alternately among themselves hymns to Christ as to a god, binding themselves by oath not to steal nor to rob, not to commit adultery, nor break their faith when plighted, nor to deny the deposits in their hands whenever compelled to restore them. These ceremonies performed, they usually departed, and came together again to take a repast, the meat of which was innocent, and eaten promiscuously. But they had desisted from this custom since my edict, wherein by your commands I had prohibited all associations (hetairai). From these circumstances I thought it more necessary to try to gain the truth, even by torture, from two women who were said to officiate at their worship, but I could discover only an obstinate kind of superstition, carried to great excess; and therefore, postponing any resolution of my own, I have waited the result of your judgment. To me an affair of this sort seems worthy of your consideration, principally from the multitude involved in the danger. For many persons of all degrees, of all ages, of both sexes, are already, and will be constantly brought into danger by these accusations. Nor is this superstitious contagion confined only to the cities; it spreads itself through the villages and the country. It is clear from this letter that Pliny had no doubt in his mind that Christianity was forbidden and punishable. It is also clear that, although this was recognized in principle, yet in practice Roman governors did not attempt to discover Christians, and did not concern themselves with the prohibited faith, unless it was specially brought under their notice. On the first occasion on which Christians were accused before Pliny, he dealt with them as with persons guilty of sacrilege on his own responsibility. But on the second occasion, when an anonymous letter reached him, containing a long list, he investigated the question more fully, and made two discoveries: one, that the number of Christians was very large, and two, that they seemed to be innocent of the crimes of incest and Thyestean banquets which were popularly ascribed to them. Consequently he hesitated to deal with the superstition as summarily as he had dealt with it before, and referred the matter to the Emperor. In reply, Trajan refused to adopt any general measure. "The Christians," he wrote, "need not be sought out. If they are brought into your presence and convicted, they must be punished. But anonymous informations ought not to have the least weight in any charge whatever." Thus Trajan upheld the principle that Christianity, being a form of sacrilegium, was punishable; but on the other hand he prescribed that Christians were only to be punished when they were accused and convicted; they were not, like robbers or sacrilegious persons of other kinds, to be sought after or hunted down. This was an inconsistent position. It was hardly logical to leave in peace the Christian whom no one happened to accuse, and condemn to death the Christian against whom an ill-wisher brought the charge of belonging to the forbidden sect. But the great significance of Trajan's rescript is that it affirmed clearly the attitude of the Roman government to Christianity, and laid down a principle which set Christians outside the pale of the law. This principle formed the basis of the religious policy of the Emperors for the 2 following centuries. It is important to observe that the crime for which a Christian was punished, according to this rescript, was not that of belonging to an illegal association, a transgression which would have come under the head of maiestas; nor was the Christian punished because he had hitherto abstained from taking part in the worship of the emperor or the gods. When a man was accused of Christianity, his judge required him to make a supplication to the emperor's image, and if he refused, punishment was inflicted for this refusal, which was accounted sacrilege. End of Chapter 24, Sections 2 and 3.
Section 4 of J.B. Bury's The Student's Roman Empire, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Student's Roman Empire, Part 2, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 24. Trajan's Principate, Section 4. Trajan's Wars and Conquests in the East. His death. Ever since Tiridates had received the Armenian diadem from the hands of Nero, peace had subsisted between Rome and Parthia. The relations between the Flavian emperors and the Arsacids had hardly been troubled by a single cloud, but under Trajan they became less friendly. King Pacorus did not decline to negotiate with Decebalus, the enemy of Rome. This negotiation, however, was not followed by any action on the part of Parthia, and did not lead to hostilities. But under Chosroes, the brother and successor of Pacorus, the crucial question of Armenia came up once more. The Armenian throne having become vacant, Trajan bestowed it upon Axidares, a son of Pacorus, but Chosroes deposed Axidares, and set up Parthomasiris, another son of Pacorus, on the ground that Axidares was incapable of governing. This action of Chosroes was a direct violation of the treaty existing between the 2 states, and Trajan was not a man to pass this over. He declared war immediately, and left Rome for the East at the end of 113 A.D. When he reached Athens, he was met by a Parthian embassy sent to divert him from his purpose, for Chosroes was not prepared for war. At this time Parthia was distracted by internal dissensions, and several rival kings were ruling in different parts of the realm. The ambassadors declared that Parthomasiris was prepared to acknowledge himself the client of Rome, and receive the diadem from Trajan as Tiridates had received it from Nero. But the emperor refused to recognize one who had been set up in defiance of his authority. He dismissed the embassy, saying shortly that he looked for deeds and not for words. Another emperor would probably have been satisfied with the compromise, and Trajan, if he had intended to follow the eastern policy of his predecessors, would not have dismissed the Parthian envoys as he did. But he had come to the conclusion that the settlement of the Armenian question which had been come to in the reign of Nero was no settlement at all, and he determined to make the position of Armenia clear by converting it into a Roman province. This step, which previous emperors had declined to take, would remove once for all every pretext for Parthian interference in Armenia, and put an end to the unsatisfactory combination of nominal Roman sway and real Parthian influence. The resolve of Trajan was quite in accordance with his previous policy in the case of Dacia and Arabia. The conversion of client states into provinces is a feature of his reign. But his purpose went even further than the annexation of Armenia. He decided to carry out an idea which had been in the air for more than 100 years, and subdue the realm of Parthia, as he had subdued the realm of Decebalus. It was a project which Julius Caesar might have attempted if he had lived. It was an inspiration of Roman poets, from Horace, who dreams of "Rome giving laws to the vanquished Medes," to Statius, who, in addressing Domitian on his 17th consulate, reminds him that Bactra and Babylon still remained to be curbed by a new tribute. From Athens Trajan proceeded to Antioch, and found that the Syrian army had degenerated in discipline and vigour owing to the long peace, so that his first task was to restore the efficiency of the troops. There were 7 legions in the east available for the Parthian war, 4 in Syria, 1 in Judea, and 2 in Cappadocia, in addition to which Trajan summoned some Pannonian reinforcements, but it is uncertain how he apportioned his forces. Hostilities had already commenced, and the advantage was on the side of the Parthians, who had taken Samosata. Before Trajan took the field in spring 115 A.D., he received a letter from the pretender Parthomasiris, of which he took no notice, because the writer styled himself king. The first event of the campaign was the recovery of Samosata. Thence Trajan marched to Satala in Little Armenia, intending to make that country the basis of his operations. At Satala he was met by the kings of various Caucasian countries, who came to assure him of their devotion and obedience, such as the Iberians, Albanians, and Apsilians. Among others, Anchialus, king of the Heniochi and Machelones, was distinguished with marks of favour by the Emperor, to whom the attitude of these northern barbarians was a matter of importance for the success of his further operations. Here, too, another message was received from Parthomasiris, couched in far humbler terms than the previous one, and begging for an interview with M. Junius, the governor of Cappadocia. Trajan sent the son of Junius to treat with the pretender, and himself, returning on his steps, proceeded with the army in the direction of Artaxata, and halted at Elegia, near Erzeroum, a locality well adapted for concentrating forces. Here Parthomasiris was permitted to wait upon the Emperor, who took his seat on a seggestus in the presence of his troops. The Parthian prince, taking the diadem from his head, laid it at the feet of Trajan, in order that the ceremonial of investiture might be performed. But the soldiers, misunderstanding his attitude, and thinking that he was renouncing Armenia, conceived that this country was won for Rome without a blow, and saluted Trajan as imperator. Frightened by the cries of the soldiers, Parthomasiris made as if he would flee, but he was surrounded and could not escape. He then begged for a private interview with the Emperor, and was led into the imperial tent. But Trajan's mind was made up, and the Parthians' offer was rejected. After a few minutes they issued from the tent. Trajan resumed his seat on the seggestus, and commanded Parthomasiris to declare his demands clearly before the army, in order that the words which passed between them might never be falsely reported. The soldiers pressed round, but Parthomasiris, in this dangerous situation, did not lose his self-possession. He said simply that Armenia rightly belonged to him on condition of receiving the diadem from Trajan's hands, that he had come of his own accord for this purpose, and not as a defeated or captured enemy, and that he expected to suffer no injury. The Emperor, in reply, shortly announced that Armenia belonged to Rome, and should henceforth be ruled by a Roman governor. Parthomasiris, with his Parthian retinue, was then permitted to depart under an escort of Roman horse, to prevent them from holding communications with anyone until they were beyond the frontiers of Armenia. The Armenians who had accompanied him were sent back to their own homes. Soon after he had left the camp, Parthomasiris was slain by his escort. It is unknown whether this act was committed in cold blood by the orders of Trajan, or whether the Parthian prince made an attempt to escape from his conductors. Armenia submitted to its fate without a struggle, and became a Roman province. The Caucasian kingdoms now stood to Rome in the same relation in which Armenia stood before. Meanwhile the Moorish captain, Lucius Quietus, who had distinguished himself in the Dacian war, had hastened eastward with a part of the army, crossed the Araxes, and occupied Atropatene, or Media. He surprised the strong and important fortress of Singara, whose possession was a great advantage for an invader of Parthia. As soon as Trajan had occupied Armenia, he marched into Mesopotamia, where he met with little resistance. Batanae and Nisibis were taken without difficulty, and the fortress of Thebitha between Nisibis and Singara secured a line of communication between the main army and the detachment of Lucius Quietus. Abgar, king of Osroene, had long ago volunteered to desert his allegiance to Parthia and became a Roman vassal. At Edessa he publicly offered his submission to the conqueror, and other phylarchs and satraps followed his example. Civil war among the Parthians hindered them from taking any steps to oppose the conquest of the land between the Euphrates and Tigris. The king Chosroes was overthrown by a pretender of Arab race, named Manisares, who now sent a message to Trajan, proposing to divide the spoils of the Arsacid. Trajan refused to entertain the proposal or admit the envoys to a conference, and Manisares allied himself with another Arab king, Manus, and prepared to oppose the advance of the Romans. But Trajan did not intend to cross the Tigris until the following year, as the season was already far advanced. He organized Mesopotamia as a Roman province, and retired to Antioch for the winter. His stay there was marked by a terrible earthquake, December 13, 115 A.D., which cost many lives and demolished a large part of the city, and Trajan himself narrowly escaped destruction. The winter was employed with the construction of a fleet on the Euphrates, which was to operate in the next campaign along with the army. Trajan, ennobled by the name of Parthicus, which the Senate had decreed to him, proceeded to Nisibis in spring, 116 A.D., and thence led his army to the upper Tigris, where it flows through the district of Corduene. The passage of the river was made on boats, which had been built in the woods of Nisibis, and transported thence on wagons. The army crossed with difficulty, for the Carduchians of the adjacent mountains lined the opposite shore, but at length, seeing that the numbers of the Romans rendered resistance hopeless, the barbarians retired. The whole country of the Adiabene was occupied by Trajan with little opposition, and was made into a third Roman province under the name of Assyria. Recrossing the Tigris, Trajan joined his fleet on the Euphrates, and reviewed his troops at Osagardana, near the bitumen springs which supplied the Babylonians with building cement. Babylon, nearly deserted by its inhabitants on account of the civil wars, fell an easy prey to the Romans, who then proceeded to attack Ctesiphon, the Parthian capital. The two rivers were connected by the Nahar Malcha, or royal canal, which joined the Tigris at Ctesiphon, and this canal was used by Trajan to transport his ships from the Euphrates to the Tigris. His plans for the siege of Ctesiphon rendered it necessary to disembark his troops on the left bank of the Tigris at a distance from the city, and accordingly a new canal was dug connecting the Nahar Malcha with the river at a point above Ctesiphon. The Romans soon captured the capital of the Arsacids. Chosroes himself escaped, but his daughter was captured, and the golden throne of the Parthian kings was taken and reserved for the triumph of Trajan. With this success the soldiers regarded Parthia as conquered, or, at least, its conquest as assured, and Parthia Capta was inscribed on coins. The Emperor then descended the Tigris with 50 ships as far as Charax Spasinu near its mouth. This place was in the territory of Atembelos, king of Messene, who submitted to the Roman conqueror and became his tributary. Old as Trajan was, his imagination was excited by this proximity to the Indian Sea. At Charax, seeing a vessel bound for the Indies, he expressed regret that he was not young enough to visit them himself. He was the first Western conqueror since Alexander the Great who had penetrated so far, and he may have dreamed of rivaling Alexander by still more extensive conquests. But he was speedily aroused from his dreams by the news that the lands which he had won so easily, Babylonia and Mesopotamia, had revolted. A legion under the general Maximus was cut to pieces by the insurgents. Nisibis, Seleucia, and Edessa slew or drove out the Roman garrisons, and shut their gates. This rebellion, in which the Jews played a prominent part, was suppressed, but not without difficulty. The important cities which had revolted were treated severely. In Babylonia, Seleucia was taken by Erucius Clarus and Julius Alexander and burnt to the ground. The recovery of Mesopotamia, where the Jewish populations were the leaders of the revolt, was entrusted to the gallant Moor, Lucius Quietus. He besieged and reduced both Nisibis and Edessa; and the city of Abgar, who had doubtless fallen a victim to the rebels, was burnt down like Seleucia. This revolt forced Trajan to be content for the present with the 3 new provinces which he had added to the Empire by his 2 campaigns, and to desist from further conquests, especially as the Parthians were rallying forces and preparing to make an attempt to wrest Armenia from its new lord. Trajan prevented their projects by a stroke of diplomacy. Although he had not penetrated further than the western borders of the great eastern realm, he regarded Parthia as a conquered country, and at Ctesiphon bestowed a crown upon Parthamaspates, son of Chosroes, who accepted it as a client of Rome. Thus a king was given to the Parthians (Rex Parthius datus, as coins record), and thus Parthia itself came to hold nominally the same position towards Rome as formerly Armenia. The Roman army then returned to Syria. On the way an attempt was made to take Hatra, a small but strongly fortified city in the Mesopotamian desert on the way from Ctesiphon to Singara. The nature of the country and the parching sun rendered a long siege impossible, and the inhabitants were brave. Though a breach was made in the walls, the soldiers could not enter. Trajan himself, approaching with a small body of horse and conspicuous by his white hair and majestic form, was the mark for the arrows of the garrison, but he escaped injury, though a horseman at his side was slain. A thunderstorm compelled the Romans to retreat, and the sufferings that they endured from the heat, noxious insects, and want of water and pasture, saved Hatra from further assaults. The Emperor returned to Antioch about April 117 A.D. The attempt of Mesopotamia to throw off the yoke of Rome was closely connected with another more widespread movement of rebellion in the eastern provinces of the Empire. 50 years had not fully elapsed since the great Jewish war which ended in the destruction of Jerusalem, and now the Jews made another desperate attempt to break free from the rule of their Roman masters. Their hope was to drive both Greeks and Romans out of those countries in which there was a considerable Jewish population — Cyprus, the Cyrenaica, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Palestine — and form an independent Jewish state. They chose the moment when the Emperor was in the far east. Wherever the insurgents succeeded, they exterminated their enemies with relentless fury. In Cyprus, which had long been the refuge of Jews from Palestine and Syria, it is said that 240,000 were slain. When the revolt was afterwards put down, the Jews were forbidden thenceforth to set foot on the island. In Cyrenaica, a senatorial province, unprotected by a military garrison, the Jewish population outnumbered the natives, and under a chief named Andrew or Lucullus, who assumed the title of king, obtained rapid successes. Here 220,000 natives were slain with great barbarity. In Egypt, the prefect, Rutilius Lupus, unprepared for the emergency, was compelled to shut himself up in Alexandria. The Jews in the city, though numerous, were in a minority, and were massacred by the Greeks. Trajan sent Q. Marcius Turbo with an army and fleet to restore order in Egypt and Cyrene, and the rebels were soon crushed by the trained troops. The Jews of Egypt were almost exterminated. The suppression of the movement in Mesopotamia by Lucius Quietus has already been narrated. Not only the Jews took advantage of the absence of the Emperor in the far east, but the enemies of Rome in other quarters also seized the opportunity to rebel or invade. The Danubian provinces were threatened by the Sarmatians. Africa was harried by the Moors. A revolt broke out in Britain. Thus Trajan's presence was earnestly demanded in the west, and the Senate urged his return. The Eastern war was regarded as finished, and preparations were made at Rome for a brilliant triumph. But, like Alexander whom he emulated, he was not destined to reach home. His journey was interrupted at Selinus in Cilicia by an illness to which he succumbed. He died on August 8, 117 A.D. The triumph over the Parthians was celebrated in his name after his death, and was the only case in which a dead Emperor obtained that honour. The consecrated conqueror, Divus Trajanus Parthicus, as he was designated, was represented by a statue in the triumphal car. His ashes, placed in a golden urn, were buried at the foot of his own pillar in his own forum, and he is the only one of the Emperors whose remains were permitted to rest within the limits of the city. Trajan must have been well aware that his easily won successes in the East had been largely due to the internal divisions of Parthia, and that his conquests would be endangered as soon as unity should be restored. The institution of a dependent Parthian kingdom cannot have been more than a temporary device for the purpose of avoiding an immediate difficulty; or at least, if Trajan intended it to be permanent, he must have known well that it would need more fighting and bloodshed to establish a lasting overlordship over Parthia. Alexander's conquests had been won at Issus and Arbela, but Trajan's had been almost bloodless. It is probable that Trajan intended to return to the east after his triumph and renew the war, for the purpose of reducing the power of the Parthians, and securing more firmly the frontiers of his new provinces. He had made the Tigris, instead of the Euphrates, the eastern boundary of the empire, and it was a boundary perhaps more easy to defend. It is rash and unjust to condemn this extension of the empire as a mistake into which Trajan was misled by mere ambition, for his conduct can be explained and defended on political grounds. Once he condemned the Armenian policy of his predecessors, and it certainly was not unassailable, and decided to annex Armenia, the annexation of Mesopotamia was a logical consequence. The province of Assyria was an advanced position beyond the Tigris, somewhat as the province of Dacia beyond the Danube. The new acquisitions should have been a great commercial advantage for Rome by bringing into her hands command of a whole line of traffic from Syria to the Persian Gulf. But owing to Trajan's inopportune death and the different policy of his successor, the empire was not permitted to test the consequences of an eastward extension of its borders. End of chapter 24, section 4.
Section 1 of J.B. Bury's The Student's Roman Empire, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lini. The Student's Roman Empire, Part 2, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 25. Literature from the death of Tiberius to Trajan, 37 to 117 A.D. Section 1. Literature under Claudius and Nero. After the lull during the reign of Tiberius, literary activity was awakened again under his successors. But it has no longer the freshness of inspiration which characterized the epoch of Augustus. The golden age has passed, the silver age has begun. There is no doubt that the political events at Rome exercised an unfavorable influence on literature. The despotism of Tiberius in his later years, the wild career of Caligula, the vicissitudes under the rule of the wives and freedmen of Claudius, the follies of Nero, did not constitute a genial atmosphere for the development of successors to Virgil, Horace, and Livy. The contemporaries of Augustus had witnessed order arisen out of disorder, and the world set to rights. But to Romans under Claudius and Nero, the world seemed to have gone mad. The men who write are no longer proud of their age or confident of the future. They regard the government with distrust, knowing not what a day may bring forth. They look upon the Caesar's palace as a scene of intrigues, guile, and violence. There's nothing in public life to inspire them. Literature retreats into itself. Most of the works produced during this period are either of a reflective character or concerned with scientific subjects, or mere imitations of older literature. In both poetry and history, the great Augustan writers are regarded as the models to be followed, and earlier authors are looked down upon as vastly inferior. All kinds of composition are marked by rhetoric, the result being that the prose is poetical and the poetry prosaic. It has been already mentioned that Claudius and Nero were themselves authors. Claudius an historian, Nero a poet. Claudius was incited in his youth to historical studies by Livy himself. None of his compositions remain, with the exception of part of the speech which he delivered in the Senate, in 48 A.D., for the admission of the Gallic nobility to the Roman magistracies. The memoirs of the Empress Agrippina were an important source for the secret history of the court of Claudius, but they have also been lost, as well as other contemporary records of their own experiences by prominent men of the day. Thus Domitius Cribulo wrote an account of his exploits in the Armenian wars. Suetonius Paulinus, whose name we chiefly associate with Britain, described his deeds in Mauritania, and Lucius Antistius Vetus wrote a work on his experiences as commander in Germany in 58 A.D. All these works, whatever their literary value, would have had great historical interest if they had been preserved. The only historian of this age whose work has reached us is Quintus Curtius Rufus, of whose life we know nothing. He wrote a history of Alexander the Great in 10 books, of which the 2 first are lost. He derived his information from Greek writers, but displayed no critical faculty in using his sources. His style is modeled on that of Livy, but is unconsciously influenced by the mannerisms of his own age. He strives ever antithetic sentences and poetical expressions. He hardly appreciates the political greatness of Alexander, but regards his eastern expedition as a brilliant adventure. He has an eye for the more telling episodes, and hurries rapidly over all that is less striking, though perhaps more important. Seneca is the most characteristic and interesting literary figure of this age. All the great Augustan writers were Roman or Italian, but Seneca was a Spaniard of Cordoba. We have already met his father, the rhetorician, a man of some literary note. The provinces are now beginning to play a prominent part in Roman literature, or rather Spain is setting the example to the other subject lands. 2 other conspicuous authors at this time were of Spanish origin, Seneca's nephew, Lucan, and Columella of Gades. The writings of Seneca reflect in many ways the spirit of the age. He wrote on a variety of subjects, but his most important works are philosophical and contemplative. His philosophy was popular in style as well as in matter. He desired the applause of his contemporaries. Literary vanity was a feature of the time, and did not write with a view to the judgment of posterity. His style was suitable to the taste of his age. He had a wide range of knowledge, a nice faculty of psychological observation, and was by no means pedantic, but his philosophy was neither original nor deep. He is always ready to sacrifice the thought to a verbal antithesis. He wrote too much, and was not sufficiently diligent in philosophy. He is often tediously diffuse, and the same sentiment meets the reader again and again, disguised in a new dress. An excellent Roman critic censures his style as vitiated by agreeable faults, such as captivate boys. It is possible that ambition was his chief motive in writing. He may have aimed at obtaining political influence by winning literary reputation, but it would be unjust to deny him a genuine interest in philosophy, especially in its practical aspect, although from a higher point of view philosophy can only regard him, like Cicero, as a dabbler. Most of his philosophical works, composed at various times, are collected in 12 books under the title of Dialogues. They treat of the following subjects: 1. If there is a providence, why do good men meet with troubles? 5. Leisure. Both of these treatises were written after his retirement from public life. 3. Anger, in 3 books. 4. The Happy Life. 6. Tranquility of Mind. 7. Brevity of Life. 2. The Wise Man Receives Neither Injury Nor Insult. Also 3 works of consolation. 8. To a Lady on the Death of her Son. 9. To Polybius the Freedman on the Loss of a Brother. And 10. To his mother Helvia on his own banishment. Beyond these dialogues there are extant the treatise On Clemency, written after Nero's accession, and 7 books De Beneficiis. Seneca also wrote a work in 7 or 8 books on questions of natural history, Naturales Quaestiones, which he dedicated to his young friend Lucilius, procurator of Sicily. We possess further a collection of letters addressed to the same Lucilius, and written with the intention of publication. They do not possess in any degree the interest which belongs to the letters of Cicero and Pliny. Seneca's satire on Claudius has been noticed already in another connection. Seneca wrote verse as well as prose. 9 tragedies have been preserved, all dealing with subjects of Greek mythology and founded on Greek originals. They are Hercules Furens, Troades or Hecuba, Phoenici or Thebais, Medea, Phaedra or Hippolytus, Oedipus, Agamemnon, Thyestes, and Hercules Oitaius. In the case of most of these plays, we possess the Greek originals, and can judge of the deplorable taste of the Neronian age by the manner in which Seneca has spoiled the works of the great masters, omitting all the finer touches, and smothering the action with declamation. The purpose of the characters in Seneca is to declaim. The action and the plot are of subordinate importance. It has been a disputed question whether these tragedies were meant for representation on the stage, and although they are in every way unsuitable for acting, it is nevertheless not impossible that in that age they may have been acted with applause. But it is probable that Seneca, in composing them, had the recitation of separate scenes before select audiences chiefly in view. The versification of these plays is very strict, and conforms to the rules of the Augustan poets. Besides the iambic trimeters and anapaests, Sapphic, Glyconic, and Asclepiad measures are also introduced, with little regard, however, to harmony of metre and subject. More interesting historically is the Fabula Praetexta, or tragedy with Roman characters, entitled Octavia, which used to be attributed to Seneca, and is always included among his works. The subject of this drama is the tragic fate of Nero's wife, and Seneca himself is one of the characters. He cannot, however, have been the author, as there is an allusion to the fall of Nero. It seems probable that the work was composed under the Flavian emperors, before the end of the 1st century, but even this cannot be regarded as certain. Seneca's contemporary and countryman, Lucius Junius Moderatus Columella of Gades, devoted himself to the subject of agriculture, and tried to revive an interest in it, somewhat as Virgil had done nearly a century before. His uncle, a learned man, was an extensive farmer in Baetica, and so he had an opportunity of studying his subject practically. He wrote 2 prose treatises on agriculture, De Re Rustica, the second much more elaborate than the first. Of the first we possess 1 book, on trees, but the second, in 12 books, has been preserved entire. One of these books, the 10th, is composed in excellent hexameter verses. The author made this variation because horticulture, the subject of this book, had been omitted by Virgil. He intended it as a sort of supplement to the Georgics, the precepts, as he says, of the sidereal bard. Here may be mentioned other books on special subjects, such as the treatise on medicaments by Scribonius Largus, and the work De Chorographia in 3 books by the geographer Pomponius Mela of Tangentera in Spain. Quintus Asconius Pedianus composed his commentary on the speeches of Cicero about 55 A.D. This highly important work has been preserved in fragmentary form. The language is pure, the comments acute. He also wrote a work against the detractors of Virgil, but it has not survived. Grammatical investigation was represented by Marcus Valerius Probus of Berytus, who made eminent Latin writers the subject of criticism and explanations, in the same way that the Alexandrine scholars treated classical Greek authors. He issued annotated editions of Virgil, Horace, and Lucretius, and he wrote and lectured on Old Latin. He enjoyed a high reputation with later workers in the same subject, as an illustrious grammarian and an acute critic. The most important writers on jurisprudence were Proculus, who gave his name to the Proculian school, and Cassius Longinus, who was banished by Nero to Sardinia and recalled by Vespasian. It is possible that some of Seneca's tragedies were composed in the reign of Claudius, but the only poetical work which we can set down as probably belonging to his age is a panegyric in hexameters on the consul Piso, by an unknown youthful author, supposed by some to be Calpurnius. The poem is full of reminiscences of the Augustan poets, with whom the author was well acquainted. The versification is strict and elegant. There are only 2 elisions in the whole poem. Of Nero's effusions only a few odd lines have been preserved, but they seem to have been read and well known long after his death. The 2 most important poets of his reign were Persius and Lucan, who resembled each other in their Stoic doctrines, their somewhat precocious talents, and in their early deaths. Persius Flaccus was born in 34 A.D. at Volaterrae in Etruria, and died at the age of 28 in 62 A.D. He studied at Rome under the Stoic philosopher Annius Cornutus, for whom he entertained an affectionate regard, to which he has given expression in his writings. Having read Lucilius, he was stimulated to write poetical satires, and he was also much under the literary influence of Horace. His 6 satires have come down to us, but only one of them, the first, is a satire in our sense of the word. In it he ridicules the poets of the day and the prevailing public taste, but the others are merely tirades or sermons on Stoic texts, embroidered with some burlesque dramatic scenes. The persons introduced are generally borrowed from Lucilius or Horace, and the verses are full of phrases, beginnings and ends of lines, taken directly or in a modified form from these poets, especially from Horace. But in both style and spirit the satires of Persius are vastly different from those of his master. The Augustan poet was a genial Epicurean who laughed good-humouredly at the follies of mankind. The Neronian verse-writer was a Stoic preacher who aspired to amend the world. The youthful Persius takes upon himself to instruct mankind. The more mature Horace is content to amuse. It is to be remarked that Persius does not deal at all with contemporary politics. He does not regret the Republic or condemn the Empire. In point of style, it is unfortunate that Persius did not profit more by his study of Horace. He could not manage the hexameter with ease. His thoughts were poor, and he labored to express them with the utmost possible obscurity. His intentions were pure, but he had no originality and no poetical gift, and he tried to cover this defect by mannerism and affectation. A friend of Persius, Caesius Bassus, may be mentioned as the chief representative of lyric poetry in Nero's reign. We do not possess any of his poetical works, but remains of his treatise on metric have been preserved. Epic poetry was very popular. Virgil was the model, and national subjects were in vogue. Nero entertained the project of writing an epos on the history of Rome. The Pharsalia of Lucan, 39 to 65 A.D., whom we have already met as one of the sufferers in connection with the conspiracy of Piso, is a poem on the civil wars in 10 books, left unfinished at the author's death. Lucan was brought up in a cultivated family. His grandfather was Seneca the rhetor, his uncle Seneca the philosopher. In his early years he was a great friend of Nero, who afterwards, however, became jealous of his literary reputation and forbade him to compose poetry. The Pharsalia was begun before the breach with the emperor, for the introductory verses contain a glowing panegyric on him. Lucan's epic must be considered a remarkable feat in its way, when it is remembered that the author died at the age of 26, but it has not a spark of genius. The practice, which was then in fashion, of reciting literary works before private audiences had a specially unfortunate effect on epic poetry. A poet, thinking of these recitations, was tempted to sacrifice the unity of the whole to the effectiveness of special scenes, which might be read aloud to applauding hearers. And for the same reason, poetry became rhetorical. The reciter wanted stuff to declaim. The Pharsalia is versified oratory, not poetry. Lucan is to be imitated, says Quintilian, hitting as usual the nail on the head, by orators rather than by poets. The choice of subject was very natural to a Stoic, breathing the atmosphere of Thrasea and Helvidius, and reared up with a deep veneration for the Senate, but from a literary point of view it was unfortunate. Pompey is the hero, but the miserable part which he played in the civil wars make the poem ridiculous. Cato is a sort of second hero, though perhaps, as has been cleverly said, the true hero is neither Pompey nor Cato, but the Senate. The cause of Caesar is denounced as crime. His victory is regarded not only as the death blow to freedom, but as the destruction of Rome's greatness. The work is full of stoical doctrine, pretentious phrases, sounding commonplaces, tedious speeches. The language is often difficult on account of its affectations, and the introduction of out-of-the-way geographical and mythological learning renders some parts of the work repulsive. But there are episodes which show considerable power of imagination, and there are many well-turned phrases, such as the epigram on Cato, Victrix causa Deis placuit sed victa Catoni, and the famous words on Pompeius Magnus, Stat magni nomini sumbra. If Virgil's epic inspired Lucan, and his Georgics Columella, his bucolics found an imitator in Calpurnius Siculus. It is uncertain whether Siculus designates the actual home of the poet, or was assumed on account of the Sicilian associations of Theocritus. He was a poor man, and begs some patron, whom he calls Melibœus, perhaps Seneca or Calpurnius Piso, to bring his productions under the emperor's notice. 7 eclogues are preserved. They are metrically exact, like the rest of the poetry of the age, but devoid of all originality, being copied from Virgil and the Greek pastoral writers. Nero, spoken of in court style as a god, is described as inaugurating a new period of freedom and clemency, and the 7th eclogue contains an account of magnificent games which he exhibited. The didactic poem entitled Aetna illustrates the tendency of the age to put the most unpromising subjects into verse. It discusses the scientific causes of volcanic phenomena, and combats the popular views diffused by the poets. The authorship is uncertain, but the most probable view ascribes the poem to Lucilius, the friend of Seneca, the same to whom the philosopher addressed his epistles. Lucilius was for a considerable time procurator in Sicily, and had an opportunity of studying the mountain. The poem contains echoes of Lucretius, but the author has none of Lucretius' power in investing a dry subject with poetic attraction. He rises higher when he is contrasting the pleasure of observing nature with the pettiness of human life. The poem ends with the story of 2 brothers who rescue their old parents in an eruption of the volcano. It is probable that to this age also belongs the Homerus Latinus, a short Latin version of the story of the Iliad, in some parts almost a translation of Homer. This was intended for use in schools, and has no merit except its scrupulously exact metre. Perhaps the most interesting work of Nero's age was the satirical work of Petronius Arbiter in 20 books. It may be considered almost certain that this Petronius was the same as the aesthetic voluptuary whose death by Nero's orders in 66 A.D. has been described in a foregoing chapter. His work, entitled Satiae, or Satiricon, recounted all sorts of imaginary adventures in which he satirized the manners and weaknesses of his age. Unluckily, only fragments of the book remain, of which the largest is the Banquet of Trimalchio, describing a feast given by a wealthy, uneducated upstart in a Greek town of Campania, probably Cumae. The person who tells the tale is a freedman named Encolpius, who recounts his travelling experiences in company with Asiltus, another freedman, and Giton, a slave, in the last years of Claudius or the early years of Nero. The work is wonderfully clever and artistic, full of wit, humor, and delicate irony, displaying wide knowledge of the world and great dramatic power in making the persons introduced speak in character. The motive which united the various parts of the composition was probably the anger of the god Priapus, who may have played a part meant to travesty that of Poseidon in the Odyssey. The work is quite devoid of any moral tendency. The author shows a fine appreciation of Greek art, and satirizes pointedly the literary taste of the day. One of the characters is a vain poet named Eumolpus, who recites two poems of considerable length, the Troiae Halossis, or Capture of Troy, in iambic trimeters, and the Bellum Civile in hexameters. But the prose narrative sometimes passes into verse and all sorts of meters, in the style of the Menippean satire. The former is clearly allusive to the poem of Nero on the same subject, and the Bellum Civile might be a parody of the Pharsalia. End of chapter 25, section 1.